When we do our curtailment analysis, we look at the LIFO stack, which is basically the projects ahead of our project that we are studying, and the LIFO stack, which is last and first out queue. And we take into account the queue reordering that has happened after CP2030 to have an idea of what are the projects that are connecting before us. And we model that and we feed that in our curtailment analysis.
Hi, I'm Toby from Blake Clough Consulting, and I'm here with Siddharth and Chanel today to talk a little bit about the Clean Power 2030 process, the ongoing grid reform, which is a process that's been drawn out for a little while now that Blake Clough have been working closely on, and also to talk about how Blake Clough have helped developers up until now and how we plan to help the developers going forwards as much as we can, as well as engaging with the system operators. Going forwards, it will be interesting to see what happens with new demand connections. I know it's a hot topic of discussion at the moment. We're seeing a vastly increased demand connections queue compared to before. And I know the regulator, Ofgem, has taken, or at least is certainly looking into how to manage the new demand connections queue. We may even see a similar connections reform process even on the demand side. Is that something we're working on as well?
Yeah, so Ofgem had recently published a call for inputs for the demand reforms. As a part of that, essentially, they're proposing 2 phases of reforms, and they're trying to do it based on 3 key pillars. So it's the connect, curate.
And then also from the perspective of new demand connections, we're seeing a massive growth in the demand queue, and Ofgem have even noticed this and are kind of looking into it and looking into how we might reform the demand connections process. How are Blake Clough helping developers who are seeking a demand connection, either at transmission or distribution?
Yeah, so we offer support right from the initial kind of feasibility up through the kind of pre-feed and design studies that developers would need to do. So at the initial stage, we have like a similar capacity scouting approach where we look at GSPs in particular and try to account for the headroom at those GSPs, pre-reforms as well as post-connections reform. The reason why I'm bringing up connections reform in this aspect is because demand headroom would be occupied typically by BESS projects because they import and export. So with BESS attrition or like BESS projects getting offered a gate 1 offer, they'd be dropping out of the queue, and that releases both thermal capacity as well as physical base space at particular GSPs or particular substations. So our assessments try to account for BESS dropping away in terms of what is the thermal headroom freed up, and as well as in general, what is the generation attrition happening at a substation to kind of help developers understand whether physical base space could be released to accommodate the demand connection, because typically demand connections or like data center connections need like an N-1 redundancy, so 2 connection circuits into the substation.
Something else that I hoped we might be able to touch on a little earlier was the difference between transmission and distribution. There's a quite well-established licensing agreement and framework between how transmission and distribution is treated in GB. And a similar approach has been taken to kind of separate out new generation connections in the queue for transmission and distribution, as well as simply just the pots being split separately. Are there any other ways in which transmission and distribution are treated differently in the Clean Power 2030 process? I'm thinking slightly about how the offers are disseminated and where the developers had to apply to as well.
Yeah, I think, no, you're absolutely right. I think in terms of the initial evidence submissions that developers had to do as a part of the previous CMP 435 window for distribution, these kind of submissions had to go through the DNO. and then the DNO would submit it on to NISO. That is if you weren't a BEGA or a BELA project. If you were a BEGA or BELA, you'd have to directly apply to NISO as well.
So that's the large embedded projects that are contracted with NISO.
Exactly. But for transmission, it was NISO that you'd have to submit your information to. So that was the initial kind of evidence submission view. But going forward in the future, how the timeline for transmission and distribution projects receiving their Gate 2 offers differs. So transmission offers typically receive it before, whether it's protected projects, whether it's phase 1 projects, or whether it's phase 2 aligned projects. And also the kind of timescales that developers have to accept or reject their offers vary. So I think at transmission, I think it's a 90 days timeline for you to kind of make a decision on your offer. But DNOs, on the other hand, have indicated that they'd probably give around up to 4 weeks for distribution projects to kind of return their offer. So it's slightly different approaches in terms of both how you apply to those CMP 435 or CMP 434 windows, as well as how the timeline in which you receive your offers and the timeline for you to accept your offers.
We're talking today on the 11th of March. A lot has happened in the last year, and it feels like a long time now since the application window for readiness submission closed. What's the status for transmission and distribution connected projects at the moment? Have they received Gate 2 offers? And have Gate 1 offers been received across the board? I know I was speaking to a developer this week that's still awaiting their Gate 1 offer, and they're hoping to receive their cash securities back. And so these issues about receiving the offers in a timely manner are kind of proving quite important for the developers. They're not, they kind of need the clarity if they're going forward with their project to be a 26 or 27 connection date, then they need the investment decision, they need the clarity. And then equally for those developers expecting a Gate 1 offer who've placed large cash securities, they're also hoping to receive those in return. So yeah, what's the status at the moment of offers coming out?
Yeah, I think we've started to see a few offers coming through now. I've heard of a few transmission ones, and I think I've heard of one BEGA project as well that's come through so far. But it's been kind of a delayed timeline in general. Like I know that it was supposed to happen last year and has been pushed out to like essentially this month. It was then supposed to happen in Jan, and then now it's been pushed to March.
Yeah, I agree with what you said, and we're currently working with many developers and hoping to work with more developers on upcoming projects that receive their Gate 2 or Gate 1 offers. And how we help them is that we look at their offers and we find ways to maybe help them advance their connection date, look for other viable points of connection, and look at their works like reinforcement works and find what can be done to connect maybe earlier, or what is the likelihood of some of these works to be dropped away post grid reform.
Yeah, and I think a big aspect of that due diligence aspect on the Gate 2 offers is cost saving as well. So if we can identify places where the DNO or NISO has included a piece of scope or a liability that actually isn't quite fair or attributable to an individual project, then from a developer's perspective, that small piece of due diligence can be incredibly valuable.
I think we're also trying to support developers to understand whether, like on the connection costs, it's also the accelerated kind of timescale for connection, as Chanel had mentioned, where even though your firm connection offer can be like a 2033 offer, we do the kind of analysis at your local substation to figure out what's dropping away, how that impacts the reinforcement works, and whether you could potentially be accommodated at that substation earlier on a non-firm basis, maybe through technical limits, through accelerated storage schemes, things like that. So we kind of help develop an argument, or like help the developer in building that argument of why they can potentially connect earlier and how they can potentially connect earlier, even under a non-firm basis.
And not only do we work with projects that have a Gate 2 offer, we also work with projects that have Gate 1 offer.
Yeah.
How we help them is understand their position in the queue once they reapply in future application windows, and also help them understand their point of connection, if they connect, how they can accelerate the connection date, and if they might be triggering reinforcement works and all of that, like similar to Gate 2, but we cater to that. And if we see that it is very unlikely for them to get a Gate 2 offer, for example, if it's a BESS project and it's like very oversubscribed and there's like very low chances of connecting, we help them maybe find other solutions such as private wire or connecting with a demand center through private wire or maybe power to X solutions. So we really help them navigate this uncertainty around the grid reform, CP2030.
Yeah, that really sounds like it's going to be an increasing trend over the next few years, the private wire solutions. And I think when the network is so congested right now, if we can find a solution that diverts from using the electricity networks and using up like valuable resource for new connections and transmission and distribution works, then that's a good thing. It serves the generation and the demand sides.
Yeah, I think we have good like capabilities in-house to support on kind of strategizing those solutions in terms of like what different combinations of technologies you can use, how you can facilitate a connection behind the meter, and also looking at it from a regulatory perspective. So doing a review of like the different licenses and codes and seeing if you need to apply for a new license or whether you fall within the kind of code outlined rules. And we also help them come up with kind of revenue models and go-to-market kind of strategies in terms of how they can potentially monetize those unique or like bespoke connection offers or connection solutions.
So another thing we touched on briefly just there was technical limits. So a non-firm connection for certain projects where they may be able to connect on a temporary non-firm basis and then have full access after the completion of transmission works. These technical limits offers, we've been seeing them for a long time, and they're also then going through the gated process. How does each stage, the firm and the non-firm connection date, how have they been affected by the queue reform process?
Yeah, so the way the firm dates have been impacted, so there's a few things that have happened in terms of the interpretation of the CNDM, the Connections Network Design Methodology. One is that TOs in general have broadly rejected advancement requests that projects that were aligned with post-2030 firm dates had made to accelerate to pre-2030 connection dates. So that means that essentially phase one offers were typically mostly given out to projects that already held phase one aligned firm connection dates. And what that means is that compared to what we had envisioned, there seems to be slightly fewer opportunities for that firm date acceleration as a result of connections reform. However, that doesn't mean that you can't accelerate or you can't connect to the network earlier. You can still do it through different solutions, through transmission A&M, through technical limits. And we can do multiple things. As Chanel had mentioned earlier, we can kind of understand where you fall within that substation queue and what are the reinforcements that you're triggering and whether that allows you to connect earlier on a non-firm basis. We also do a lot of kind of curtailment modeling in terms of understanding the attrition from the gate 1 queue, like projects dropping away, and how that impacts your queue position within the LIFO stack. And then figuring out how much total energy is going to be curtailed for your project based on different kind of outage conditions. It could be under technical limits. It could be intertrip conditions. Mm-hmm. We have like a broad range of expertise to cover like all different kind of combinations and scenarios.
Okay, so we've obviously provided curtailment analysis for lots of our clients in the past. And I know, Chanel, you work on that today. How do we expect the results of Clean Power 2030 to play into our curtailment analyses and how we're using those outcomes even now in our curtailment projects?
That's a good question. When we do our curtailment analysis, we look at the LIFO stack, which is basically the projects ahead of our project that we are studying, and the LIFO stack, which is last and first out queue. And we take into account the queue reordering that has happened after CP2030 to have an idea of what are the projects that are connecting before us. And we model that and we feed that in our curtailment analysis. So CP2030 has affected our analysis, and looking at the projects that we have carried with the CP2030, we have seen that a lot of projects have dropped away. So our queue position has been better, and the curtailment, like the total curtailment, has been lower generally.
So the cumulative megawatts ahead of you in the LIFO stack underneath an individual GSP is decreasing.
Has decreased.
And that's decreasing the loading on the constraints. And yeah, seeing much less curtailment. So that's a good thing for those developers that have been able to stick it out in the Gate 2 process. Another question I've got written down here that we wanted to ask is about the misconceptions that people might have about the Gate 2 to whole queue process. I don't know if either of you have any suggestions for things that people often get wrong, or even missteps that developers have taken or may still take in as the queue reform continues.
Yeah, I think there's a couple that come to mind immediately. One is the kind of way CMP434, the queue ordering is going to be done in CMP434 versus what was done in CMP435.
So CMP435, just to stop you there, that's the current window or the future window?
That's the current one, the just closed essentially. And 434 is the enduring future windows that are supposed to happen every 2 years essentially. So the current queue ordering in CMP435 was typically done based on your planning consents, and then like based on your planning status essentially, and then after that your contracted queue position. So this is typically like the NISO counter signature date that you had. So that was the kind of order in which projects were reshuffled. And obviously if you aligned within phase 1, you were then reordered back in terms of your original queue position. For CMP434, one key aspect is that all projects applying in a future window are going to be added to the back of the CMP435 Gate 2 tranche or any preceding CMP434 Gate 2 tranche. So you're going to be joining at the back of the queue. Within that kind of CMP434 tranche, first it's going to be projects that are kind of like designated. So there's certain criteria for a project to meet designation. If you're a new technology, if you provide some security of supply services, for example, then you can qualify for those. But NISO has said that they want to kind of sparingly use that designation and reservation criteria. After designated projects, it's projects that are consented, and these projects are not ordered by their kind of queue position or like application submission date. They're ordered by the date they obtain planning consents. And then behind all of those consented projects. So, and this, from our understanding, this also includes there being no specific kind of division between protected and non-protected projects. So if you're a 3A protected project, who'd obtain consents after another project that didn't have 3A consents, within that CMP434 tranche, you'd still be kind of put behind the non-3A protected project. And after that comes all projects, regardless of whether you're planning submitted or land rights only. And all those projects are ordered by their kind of land readiness date. So it's the date that they sign their land rights. So maybe when they kind of sign their option agreement, countersign their option agreement, or when they obtain the title deed, essentially. So it's a slightly different queue ordering process across the two.
Yeah, speaking of like protected projects and all of that, a misconception is that if a project is protected, for example, through Protection Clause 3B, and they have submitted their planning before July 2025, that does not mean that they are guaranteed a Gate 2 offer, because it also depends if they have exceeded the zonal capacity bucket. So for, let's say, if a BESS project has a Protection Clause 3B, but they exceeded the capacity bucket for 2035, then that means they have a Gate 1 offer. So we should like clarify the difference between the two.
I think, yeah, that's a good point. I think another like common misconception we've seen is with the interpretation of NISO's published solar undersupply results. So I think And he sort of published 3 zones. I think it was T4,
and T10.
Yeah, T4, T5, and T10, in which they had said that there's some undersupply available for future CMP434 windows. They'd also so this was within a certain set of documents. Then they explained why there was undersupply in those zones on a separate call. And essentially the reason for that was that the next project in the queue for each of those zones was much like it was the size of that project was more than double the size of the remaining capacity within those zones. So instead of exceeding the bucket, allocating a gate 2 offer to the next project, or maybe even skipping that project and going through each project consecutively until they find a project that fits, they've just left that capacity as an undersupply for CMP434. But that doesn't reflect the level of competition within those zones. So there could still be a lot of Gate 1 projects that have obtained land lying within those zones, and because they've obtained land, have a better readiness date than a new greenfield project, and they could access capacity, or they would be prioritized in terms of access to that undersupply in future CMP434 windows. So it's important to understand what the level of competition is across all zones when you're looking for greenfield development. And this is something that we help with because we've done extensive mapping of grid data to planning data to try to understand which projects are getting Gate 1, Gate 2 offers and which zones these projects lie in. So we can help you understand what the level of competition for solar and onshore wind development is across each of the different distribution and transmission zones.
Okay, that brings us to the end of the discussion. Thanks, Chanel and Siddharth, for your contributions. If anything that we discussed today interests you or you want to find out more, please get in touch with either one of the panel or our info address email available on the website, and we'll be happy to help.